Hi there, and thanks for tuning in once again to the Explaining History podcast. And today I want to talk about the class tensions and violence that existed in Spain in the 2 decades before the Spanish Civil War that begins in 1936. Because these tensions help us to understand the causes of the Civil War in much greater context, and they help us to understand really the politics of kind of a revolutionary era in Spain, and we can also see them in a wider European context. Spain is interesting in that where we start our journey in 1918 in Spain, Spain had obviously not been a participant in the First World War, but the tensions, the political tensions and crises and social crises generated by the war, Spain was not insulated from. 1918 is a year of political violence and revolution across Europe. In 1917, obviously, the Bolsheviks had seized power in October in Russia. At the end of the First World War, there is a revolution in Germany. There are revolutionary uprisings in Italy, there are mutinies in France, there are even mutinies in the British Army as British soldiers, after the end of the war, demand to go home, and there is a fear by David Lloyd George in 1918 and later into 1919 as well that violence and unrest might engulf Great Britain. So what we'll observe when we look at the story of Spain in 1918 through to the mid-1920s is a picture that makes an overall sense in a European context. So firstly, a bit of terminology for those not versed in Spanish history. We're going to be looking at two main social classes, the latifunda, the landowners, who owned the big landed estates in Spain, and the jornaleros, or the landless day labourers, the poorest of the labouring classes, who were seen by the latifunda as being almost subhuman. Now, there is an interesting intersection between class antagonisms and racial ideas here. The view that the Spanish landowners had was that the poorest of the poor, the jornaleros, or braqueros as they were also known, were a kind of almost like an Untermensch. They assumed that they were not fully a European kind of Spaniard, in that the many waves of conquest and immigration into Spain during the Middle Ages, from the Middle East, from the Moor invasions of Spain, and the existence up until the 15th century of Jews in Spain, had somehow tainted this lowest class of Spaniard. And so they were viewed, there was an interesting influx of racial ideas where you're talking about an ethnically homogenous group. The idea that the landless labourers, who were very often burned by the sun, they had darker, more weather-beaten features, and they were actually physically dirtier a lot of the time. They were seen as a darker, browner people than than Spain's elites, helped to foster this sense of otherness. And from a lot of the reading that I've done on the condition of peasants in Europe in the early 20th century, there seems to be nothing quite like it. Even in Russia, following the emancipation of the serfs, there is generally, within the more enlightened members of the aristocracy, a spirit of paternalism. You only need to look at people like Tolstoy for evidence of that. There was a belief that the peasants in Russia, the former serfs, were, whilst a rough bunch, something inherently good about them. This, after 1917, proves to be somewhat misguided on the part of the landowners, who were en masse killed by the peasants and expropriated by them. But there you go. In Spain, there doesn't seem to be any evidence, and I could indeed be wrong. This is only evidence from my own reading, but there doesn't seem to be any clear evidence of a latifunda paternalism towards the llaneros in that way. Between 1918 and 1921, just as I had been between 1919 and 1921 in Italy, there is an explosion of unrest in the countryside that is referred to as the 3 Red Years, or the 3 Bolshevik years, Trienio Bolshevik, the 3 Bolshevik years. And it is assumed by the landowners that the landless peasants have been influenced by the Russian Revolution, and they are trying to bring about class warfare in the countryside. The reality is probably quite different. Yes, there were communist parties, the Communist Party members amongst the peasantry, but a great many of them were illiterate. They were unable to really fully engage with Marxist ideas and arguments, and they were not overly interested in a dialectical view of history. They're interested in land and food, both of which by 1918 are in short supply. These are labourers who are hired as and when. There is some allowance for those labourers to go doing things like poaching for rabbits on the land of the latifunda, and this all is and finding scraps of food here and there. But the anger that the landowners have when these uprisings are put down ends this any kind of largesse at all. The situation becomes much more brutal for the peasants. The landowners view them as the enemy, whilst the peasants are still working on their land. They think that really there's a popular belief that no cruelty to crush the insubordination of the peasantry is excessive. It's interesting, actually, that the landowners are in something of decline as a result of the First World War. Neutrality had brought the ruling classes of Spain a great deal of wealth. They hadn't risked their fortunes in the war, and the war was an industrial boom for every neutral country, probably in the world, that had an industrial base. Spain's was developing very slowly, and the ability of Spain to produce manufactured goods to sell overseas, and the ability of Spain to lend money, enriched her industrial and financial classes. And these classes were in a kind of an uneasy relationship with the landowners, who'd traditionally been the main source of wealth and power in Spain. So the landowners felt somewhat threatened by, not just by the peasants, but by the people that they considered to be on their side. They're people with similar class interests. But from 1918 onwards, a solid alliance was built between industry, finance, and the landowning class, in order to see off the threat of Bolshevism and the threat of unionised labour in the cities, and possibly even unionised labour in the countryside. And at the disposal of the landowners and the financial and industrial class were the civil guard, the Spain's paramilitary police force, which was the rule of law in the countryside, and the army. The army crushed the Communist Party in August 1917, and up until 1923 there is a civil war, an undeclared civil war, but a civil war nonetheless, going on in the countryside. The civil war that begins in 1936 and had been sort of simmering since about 1931 was really, in the eyes of the likes of Franco and the other generals, the conclusion of unfinished business from the early 1920s. And the country is divided between north and south. In the south, largely agrarian, you have peasant uprisings. And in the north, in places like Catalonia and the Basque, you have strikes and lockouts and industrial action due to wage cuts and the ever-present job insecurity. The reason why there are wage cuts is because Spain, like everywhere else in Europe, faces the immediacy of the post-war recession. In the middle of all this is an anxious middle class, fearing the possibility of communism, the lurid and very often quite real stories from Russia of the fate of the bourgeoisie in every country in Europe has the middle classes feeling extremely vulnerable and anxious. And this is prime territory for the dissemination of fascist ideas, particularly anti-Semitism. The popularity of anti-Semitic myths in Spain in the early 1920s is far, far greater than that of Germany in the early 1920s. Most German far-right nationalist anti-Semitism is kept on the fringes of acceptable discourse. Not so in Spain. There's another force that is managing to spread this very successfully. And it's an extreme form of Catholicism that identified the threat of communism and the existence of Jews as one and the same thing. Ironically, there really aren't any Jews in Spain. If there are, there's a tiny, tiny handful. Spain had exiled its Jews many centuries beforehand in the 1400s. And so when we talk about the influence of Catholicism, this was not a doctrine that emanated from Rome or from any official source of the Catholic Church. It was an extreme right-wing conspiracy theory that the progenitors of were largely, almost exclusively, of the Catholic faith, obviously Spain being a Catholic country, but and also the ideas stemmed from medieval Catholic conspiracy theories. These ideas of a Jewish plot against Christendom had existed in medieval Spain, and they were resurrected in the 19th century in order to undermine social reform, and then again in the 20th century in order to attempt to galvanise the population against the threat of communism. In 1912, for example, the Masonic and Anti-Semitic League was founded by Jose Ignacio Urbina, and he was supported by 22 Spanish bishops, one of whom, the Bishop of Almeria, wrote, "Everything is ready for the decisive battle that must be unleashed between the children of light and the children of darkness, between Catholicism and Judaism, between Christ and the devil." These suspicions are amplified by the events of 1917 in Russia, and the belief that a kind of a worldwide conspiracy was commencing. It's only in 1923 when General Miguel Primo de Rivera launched a military coup and established himself as a dictator that the anxieties of the upper and middle classes are quelled. Now a military strongman had presented himself in order to protect the nation from the threat of communism. And obviously, the parallels with Germany here are difficult to ignore. It just so happens that Spain was far easier to seize by the forces of the far right far earlier than Germany was, and obviously so was Italy. As with all fascisms, Rivera relied heavily on disseminating anxieties popularly, and was keen to continue with the anti-Semitic, anti-communist, and also anti-Freemason myths. There was a belief that the Freemasons were involved in the sinister Jewish plot, and that the Freemasons were almost the dupes of the Jews. And the continued idea that this kind of Manichaean struggle between light and dark was at play in Spain, and that Spain was really involved in a fight to the death between both sides, had a great hold in Spanish society. And it meant that left-wing ideas in general were profoundly delegitimised throughout the 1920s. To be a trade unionist, a socialist, or a communist was to be popularly seen as unpatriotic, to be seen as siding with the foreign other and siding against Spain. Part of the measure of Spanishness was a political one. People with the wrong political ideas were delegitimized as Spanish themselves. They were accused by the popular fascist media and the Rivera regime as being non-citizens, as being non-members of the national or perhaps even the racial body. Interestingly, however, Rivera's regime was not sufficiently draconian for the landowners' tastes. Rivera combined authoritarianism with a degree of paternalism, seeing the long-term future of Spain as one whereby the peasants were ruled tightly but looked after as well, in order to really drain the swamp of revolutionary ideas. And as strategies go, it probably wasn't a bad one. However, the attempt to introduce egalitarianism into the army to ensure that promotions were earned on merit, and that the hold of the landowning class over the army, whose sons very much filled the ranks of the army, very often without any real talent, that was reduced. This sees the army stand aside in 1931 when there is renewed elections, and the a coalition of Republicans and Socialists sweep to power. And under the rule of this new left-of-centre government, Spanish fascist parties and extreme nationalist parties thrived. The development of conspiracy theories and the continuation of this relentless argument that Jewish, Freemason and Bolshevik forces were aligning to undermine Spain had fresh urgency in the eyes of Spain's middle classes. And the period from 1931 to 1933 is one of greatly amplified violence, almost all of it directed against the peasants. The new coalition, or the Republican Socialist coalition that took power, had plans to radically reform Spain, to attack the main power blocks of Ancien Regime Spain, the Catholic Church, the army and the landowners, and to reform the laws as it related to all three. And this was, in their eyes, a declaration of war. And the countdown to a real war which happens 5 years later, begins in the spring of 1931 with the new agenda set by the coalition. Agrarian reform is the first shot fired, which shows the landowners which way the wind is blowing, and the speed at which tensions escalate is due to the belief that a new front has opened in the war against what the landowners view as civilization itself, that Russia being the first front, Spain being the second, and that that the final battle is nigh. We need to remember the context of the early 1930s as well. The world has experienced a global economic slump. Spanish labourers who have been working in other countries, working in France, working in Italy, have returned. The number of jobless has swollen. There is violence on the left as well. The Spain's strong anarchist tradition has the anarchist parties viewed the government as being not as being a revolutionary socialist government, of which they would rather like, but one which would make very little change at all and would really be kind of like a placeholder for capitalism awaiting its return. And so there were violent clashes from the anarchist parties as well. And it was in part this disorder on the left that encouraged the right to think at that point seemingly the unthinkable of seizing power. The army and the civil guard are largely in support of the right, though obviously in 1936 large sections of the army still declare for the Republic and are willing to fight for it. The civil guard saw their role as, in some ways, almost a quasi-religious one. They were outraged, along with the army, at the attempt by the coalition government to break the power of the Catholic Church in Spain. And they saw it as an almost sacred and moral duty to resist this. And this is an explanation as to some of the violence against the peasants, which eventually manifests itself in arbitrary mass killings. However, as with Nazi Germany, particularly during the war and the invasion of Russia, the belief that the people who were being murdered were less than human, who were members of the national or racial body, and who were a kind of a Spanish equivalent of Untermensch, made all this far more possible. One of the responses of the landowners to agrarian reform was to starve the peasants into submission, to either lock them out of their estates, to refuse to plant or sow any crops or harvest. The landowners felt that they could wait the peasants out, or to enforce 16-hour days and pay for 8 hours. That sort of thing. And when the peasants were hungry and destitute, to tell them, well, let the Republic sort it out, let them feed you. They are so much more interested in your welfare than we are. And this antagonism obviously led to unrest in the countryside and attempts at reprisals by the peasantry, but the peasantry don't have the civil guard on their side or any force really whatsoever, and invariably come off worse. Okay, so I'm going to finish there. Thanks very much for listening. If you want to hear more about Spain this week, subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can either find me Nick Shepley or Explaining History. Get yourself on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, and I'll be doing some Spain updates this week, some extra free content for you. Anyway, hope you find that interesting, and I'll catch you later. All the best, take care, bye bye.